Welcome to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. AmCham business podcasts are hosted by Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff is a director of Exec Search International, an author, and is also on the AmCham Council of Governors. AmCham, bringing business to you.
Welcome to the American Chamber of Commerce Business Podcast. Hello, my name is Duff Watkins, and today we address the issue of the role of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. In other words, why AmCham and why Australia? Our guest today is Niels Marquardt. He's the CEO of AmCham in Australia. And Niels has had an interesting background for 33 years. He was a career diplomat for the United States of America. He has been a U.S. ambassador to a few countries. He has also been a high-level U.S. Consul General to several other countries. And he is very much a citizen of the world, and he is our guest here today. So welcome, Niels. Good to have you on the show.
Great to be with you again, Duff.
Niels, I know that you're a staunch advocate of doing business in Australia, as I am. And I know why I am, but why are you such a staunch advocate?
Well, as you mentioned, I came here via a long journey. It took me a lot longer to find Australia than you did, Duff. But when I got here, I was really struck by the positive environment for doing business here for Americans and really for anyone. I think there are a number of factors. First of all, let's just put it right out there. I think Yanks and Aussies just get along in a way that you seldom see between any two other nationalities. So doing business is a pleasant experience. The cross-cultural aspect of it is pretty minimal, although there are a few differences. I think the wealth of Australia means that there's a lot of purchasing power here, and I think Australians are really quite open to American goods and services, products, brands. I think they gravitate naturally to something that's American. And, you know, the climate for, dispute resolution, I mean, in my time as Consul General, I never was dragged into the middle of anything that two parties couldn't work out themselves, which is different. Every other place that I served as a diplomat, I was generally involved at one point or another in trying to help people resolve things that they couldn't resolve themselves. I won't say it never happens, but I can't even cite one example of an American dispute with Australia. And so the rule of law is strong. People get a fair hearing. There's no discrimination. So you don't find very many markets around the planet where all those conditions obtain.
One of the similarities that I've noted is that there is great transparency in Australia and in the U.S. In other words, our legal systems, our accounting systems are very similar. So a lot of times American businesses will come to, well, it's just easier. They probably feel a bit more comfortable. And as you say, there's an affinity between Aussies and Yanks. You've worked with different AmChams around the globe. In fact, you've helped set up a few, as I understand. What have you learned from those?
Well, I've learned that really AmChams are an indispensable part of the investment and business landscape in overseas countries. I think it's very important to have an organization that's looking at the big picture and trying to advocate on behalf of the membership of that AmCham. Changes that would make the investment climate, the business climate, even better and stronger. Australia, as I said, offers one of the very best, but it doesn't mean that there aren't areas where improvements can be advocated and implemented. So I think getting American and Australian member companies, because we have both in the AmCham, it's not just American companies, around a table to figure out what common interests are and what approach would advance those interests under the AmCham logo. And that's something that I've been involved in virtually every country I've lived in overseas. So for me, it's a great privilege to be part of the AmCham experience here in Australia.
You know, that's my standard joke. People think about that the American Chamber of Commerce as a bunch of Yanks walking around eating donuts, drinking coffee, and talking baseball. And the truth of the matter is the Americans that are in AmCham are citizens like me, and of course mostly Australians who are working for U.S. multinationals. So what are the hot topics? What are the key challenges that are facing businesses facing in Australia now?
Well, I think the biggest one for just about everyone in Australia, businesses and individuals, is the high cost of doing business in Australia. It's a very expensive place to do business, but that shouldn't deter folks, because some of our member companies are more profitable and have greater success here in this market than they have virtually anywhere on the planet. So it's something to be taken into account. It's something where I think AmCham can have an important voice in trying to help. I mean, the government's very aware. Successive governments have been aware that the cost of doing business in Australia is an issue. You certainly don't want it to be a case of killing the goose that laid the golden egg. But I think attention needs to be paid to taxes, and at some point, industrial relations will be addressed in this country, because I think some of the costs of labor here are on a global scale at the end of the spectrum.
That's very true. I'm just thinking what you said about. I know of several examples in my own experience where the Australian subsidiary of a U.S. multinational was the jewel in the crown. It was the top performing subsidiary outside the U.S., even with whatever idiosyncrasies or eccentricities we have here in Australia. They still find a way to do very, very good business.
Yeah, I can think of lots of examples. I mean, to me, it's amazing that a country with about 23 million people could possibly be one of the biggest markets for a global multinational like Boeing or General Electric or Bechtel or Caterpillar. But for all of these companies, Australia is one of their most important markets. In the case of Boeing, it's their largest overseas footprint, and they're doing advanced manufacturing, which many people today, question whether there's a future for advanced manufacturing in a high-cost market like Australia. Well, these companies are proving that it can be done. I think one of the biggest issues for AmCham is trying to push for the best possible conditions for promoting investment in innovation in Australia, because Australia has such an educated workforce, has cutting-edge research and development institutions, universities. All the elements are here, and that's why some of these companies have such high-tech operations here. But I think we need to be sure that we're promoting an even better environment, so that we don't get priced out of this market, and so that we make sure that all the incentives are in place for both Australians and foreign companies to do as much of their R&D here as possible.
Now, you mentioned the big picture and getting priced out. That leads me to ask you, I've been reading, and I'm sure you have too, about the Asian century, and it smacks of a diminished role for countries like Australia and even the U.S. You've been around the traps. What do you reckon?
Well, I think, the Asian century, 2 billion citizens of the earth who are moving from poverty into the middle class is a huge opportunity for really anybody who's paying attention. Australia is well positioned because we're basically here in Australia in the same time zone as more than half of humanity, and so that is an advantage in doing business. And of course, the multicultural nature of Australia, which I think many people overseas don't quite appreciate. This is an extremely cosmopolitan country with lots of people who speak exotic languages, and then of course they speak Chinese, of course they speak Japanese, Hindi, etc. So all the elements are in place here for Australia to play a big role in this so-called Asian century. But I think it's important not to lose sight of sort of some basic facts. The United States role in Australia is enormous and will remain so. The foreign minister has described the United States as Australia's most important economic partner, and has suggested that that's not about to change. I agree entirely, and I think
on what basis, Niels, did he say that?
Well, this was Julie Bishop who made that quote, and it was on the basis of the enormous amount of investment in Australia. The United States collectively has invested over $600 billion in Australia, And in the other direction, I mean, the Australians have, on a per capita basis, are one of the biggest investors in the United States with over $400 billion invested there. So between the two countries, you have an investment relationship worth more than $1 trillion. You wouldn't find that with any other country, not even close. If you'd ask, the average man on the street, he'd probably say, well, I think China's the most important investor here. Well, I think they're something like number 10 on the list, and the gap is not closing, it's widening. And, why is that important? I think the main reason it's important is how many people in Australia and in the United States have high-paying jobs because of this investment. I mean, how many Australians do you know that work for large American companies? I mean, there are tens and tens of thousands of people who work for companies like GE and, ConocoPhillips. The list is a long one. These are great jobs. And the same is true in the United States, where companies like BHP Billiton and Westfield have huge investments. So both of us are betting on each other in a really important way. And then when you look at the trade, the United States is no longer the leading trading partner of Australia, but we're one of the top three. And when you look at the basket of goods and services that go back and forth across the Pacific, it's a very diversified basket that includes, as I mentioned before, advanced manufacturing products coming out of high-tech factories in Australia, beef and lamb, wine, beer, everything in between. So it's not the boatloads of unfinished mineral ores, coal that really rack up huge numbers when they're sent off to Asian countries. Those are bigger numbers. But when you take the trade and the investment, and I would call it the innovation pipeline between the two countries, there's really no one else comes close.
That reminds me of were you here when the free trade agreement was hotly debated between Australia and the U.S.?
I hadn't arrived yet, but I'm certainly aware of the elements of that debate.
Yeah, it was interesting, and now it's been years down the track. Are you in a position to comment on that? How is the free trade agreement working out for the U.S. and for Australia?
Yeah, it's been, in fact, we're already working on plans to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Free Trade Agreement in 2015. So it's been around for a decade. There were a number of controversial elements. There were people that feared that at the time that, for example, the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, would come under enormous pressure from the FTA, and that this, which is something I think Australians are very proud of, could be in jeopardy. Well, 10 years later, the price of pharmaceutical products in Australia has fallen. The sky has not fallen, and PBS is alive and well. In sort of macro terms, trade has more or less doubled over this period. The United States, I think it's not surprising, the United States has a trade surplus with Australia, given the large range of goods and services in which we have economies of scale that would be very difficult to achieve in this country. But the United States remains one of the most important export markets for a number of Australian products as well. I think both sides have benefited a great deal, and right now in 2014 we're looking to the sort of successor, which is the TransPacific Partnership trade negotiation. AmCham is a huge proponent of free trade in general and of the TPP in particular. We believe that the lessons of the Australia-U.S. free trade agreement show that that enormous benefits can flow to all the participants in this particular negotiation if political courage is shown, and by all countries, including the United States, in terms of opening markets that are politically sensitive. So that discussion is ongoing as we speak here today with Duff.
Well, yeah, can you give me an update on that? I don't know if I told you this, but your successor, Hugo Lorenz, the current U.S. Consul General to Australia, he came up to me and he was saying, there's no buzz. There's no buzz about the TPP. There's no excitement about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And he didn't understand why. So what is the latest with the TPP?
Well, I do think that's a problem in terms of the lack of very vocal support here in Australia for something that is going to be highly beneficial. I mean, we have this discussion ongoing in the G20 under Australian leadership about how to increase global growth by 2% above what would be the normal trend line, and I think by expanding free trade and opening new markets, that's one of the most effective ways to achieve that growth. And I think there's been, probably too much emphasis on bilateral free trade discussions. Those are sort of, I'd say, third best. A bilateral trade agreement is not as good as a multilateral trade agreement, and the best of all, of course, is a global trade agreement. So since the collapse of the Doha discussions out here in the Asia-Pacific region, we've been looking at the TPP. It would cover some 40% of global GDP, about 30% of global trade. And I think, the most important thing about it is that it would create a template going into the future for the long dreamed of Asia-Pacific free trade agreement that would include all the countries of the region, and very much including China. We would like the TPP to be the template for including China eventually, and when is really up to the Chinese. Eventually in a regional trade agreement that included all countries here.
And what would Australia's role be in that, do you think?
Well, Australia is an important voice for free trade. I think Australia is one of the most open economies in the region. I mean, Australia could, successively has benefited from different export booms. There was the wool boom of the 19th century, and lamb and beef exports, agricultural exports, and more recently iron ore and coal that have generated a lot of Australian prosperity. So the country historically has been a leader globally in pushing for open markets, and I think that's going to continue, and including pushing the United States to open some markets that we're finding politically difficult. The same ones that are always there: dairy, sugar. Generally, we want a 21st century trade agreement, but it's sort of 19th century trade problems that are preventing us from or slowing the process of getting there. But we will.
It's well known. Don't mention sugar. Everybody knows that. They just don't want to hear it. Well, what are the okay? You've come into an interesting situation. You're how long have you been in the CEO role at AmCham now?
It's going to be a year in October, so about over 10 months.
Yeah, almost a year. So it seems like longer, I guess. But you inherited an organization that had been, I suppose, pretty stolid for a while. So what I'm working up to is what are the trends that you see happening in business now from an AmCham perspective?
Well, I think one of the most important areas that we're moving into, perhaps more than we were in the past, is advocacy. And again, this is a wonderful market, but there are issues, taxation issues, for example. Right now, we're working very hard with both Australian and American authorities to get tax treaty negotiators from both countries to sit down together and modernize the tax treaty that governs taxation between the two countries. I've talked earlier about the high cost of doing business in Australia. Obviously, if individuals and corporations are paying taxes that they shouldn't be or might not have to, then that would eliminate a cost that's bearing down on those working in this market. So that's one priority that we've taken on. And it's not new. I mean, AmCham was very involved in this 15, 20 years ago, the last time we modernized the treaty. Unfortunately, it has to happen again only 15 years later. So that's one issue. And then we're building out a structure of committees and working groups to try to give our members an opportunity for more intense engagement with AmCham and with counterparts in other companies. For example, we will launch in October, based in Canberra, a defense and security working group that will bring to the table both major, prime defense contractors from the United States and perhaps also from other countries. The AmCham's open to everybody, but also consultants, people in the financial and accounting world that are specialized in this area. And these working groups or committees come up with their own agendas that respond to what members' interests are. A lot of it will be around trying to find ways to reduce the cost of doing business in Australia. For example, we're also setting up resources and energy working group based out of Perth, and I think one of the common interests there is to bring more competition to Australia, specifically from the United States, but perhaps from other countries, so that when major investments like what's going on up in Gladstone with coal seam gas exports to Asia, or what's happening on Barrow Island out in the Indian Ocean. These are multi-billion. These are some of the biggest resource projects ever undertaken anywhere. And so, if you could reduce by 5%, the cost of those projects by bringing in more competition, then that would be a significant. We're talking billions of dollars there. That would be a significant improvement. So these committees and working groups and the advocacy that will sort of come up in a bottom-up way, and then be advocated with the AmCham logo on it and with the voice of AmCham representing all of our members. I think that's an area where I see scope for expansion and improvement and increased engagement.
You're illustrating what I've been saying for a long time, because as you know, I've been a member of AmCham for about 100 years, it seems. But yeah, I always describe AmCham as like an iceberg. People sort of see the public events, but the actual bulk of the work is done sort of below the waterline. The committees, the advocacy, the expediting of trade between the two countries. Most people, the public doesn't always see that, but that's where the action is.
I couldn't agree more, Duff. I think some people perceive, and look, AmCham's like a menu. If you're a member of AmCham, you can go down the menu, and it's like, I'm interested in this. I'd like to have networking and business development opportunities, and the large lunches and sometimes breakfasts and other events that we do serve that purpose. But that's probably the most visible side. But there are invisible sides. We do a lot of CEO breakfasts and lunches and events that bring together the most senior representatives of companies to have frank and confidential exchanges about what their experience is doing business in Australia and what are the issues that can be addressed and improved, either through an AmCham process or otherwise, because many of these companies belong to multiple organizations, and I think their approach would be a pretty sophisticated one, where they would be using all the levers available to get their message across to governments. And when I say governments, because I mean Washington as well. We took a small delegation this year to Washington in June to lobby for, among other things, the TransPacific Partnership, also the reauthorization of the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which has been which actually has its largest exposure anywhere here in Australia.
Really?
Most people don't know that. No,
yeah.
These huge projects are going forward on a competitive basis with a lot of support from AmCham. But the point is, we're also knocking on doors in Washington saying, these are things that, identifying issues where policymakers and lawmakers in the United States need to pay attention as well if this wonderful bilateral economic relationship is to be maintained at the highest possible level.
Okay, one last question for you. AmCham, for those who don't know, AmCham is a 53-year-old organization. It is the oldest, largest, most prestigious international chamber of commerce in Australia. And so it's been around for a long time. So my question for you, Niels, is I know that you're intensely, actively engaged with other AmChams in the region. You're pretty much engaged with everybody from what I can tell, which is really good. What is the impact that you hope to have on AmCham here in Australia?
Well, the way you just described it is the way I want AmCham to be, and it needs to be the most effective, the most visible, the most influential international business group in Australia. And I think it needs to be that because the United States is the most important economic partner of this country. So those two things go hand in hand, but you can't just sit there and rest on your laurels and say, well, we've got $1 trillion investment relationship, therefore, everything's fine, or listen to me. We need to engage with our members and find out, what in 2014 their concerns are. I mean, they've changed over time. You look at something like transborder data flows, the cloud, and all the issues that are attendant to policy decisions that could or could not be made to either facilitate or to perhaps retard the role that the cloud can play in business. I mean, that's just one example, but that's something. I mean, people 2-3 years ago weren't even talking about the cloud.
Yeah.
So it's important to have these discussions with our members where they bring to the table, the latest thinking about what their company's view is about opportunities in Australia and how best to achieve them.
We'll finish here today, Niels. You've been listening to the American Chamber of Commerce Business Podcast, bringing business to you. Today our guest has been the Chief Executive Officer of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, Niels Marquardt, and we thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Business Podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. This podcast is supported by Lenovo and VML. Lenovo is one of the world's leading personal technology companies, producing innovative PCs and mobile internet devices. Lenovo, for those who do. VML is a full-service digital marketing agency that can take you where you want to go. Everything we are is in everything we do. This is